When last we met in part 1, we defined wellness using Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a roadmap to establish how we might achieve wellness, which we located at the top of the pyramid, signifying complete rather than partial wellness. We then used Lacanian psychoanalytic theory to explore how the wellness industry as it stands is limited to ego management without ever addressing the unconscious drives and desires at the root of our enjoyment, our suffering, and our unwanted behavior, aka therapism. Having escaped from the clinic to capture mass culture, therapism focuses on exercises, behavior modification, and mindset. These are not bad tools, but they are woefully incomplete. We then explored how therapism and wellness culture under capitalist society promote the dangerous distortions such as toxic positivity, the myth of the true self, and wholeness, the pursuit of which leads to suffering and self-destruction, as we discovered last time. Part 1 analyzed the deformed and degenerated form of wellness expressed under capitalism and showed how better and more complete concept of wellness is possible with psychoanalytic theory. But both therapism and psychoanalysis only address the higher rungs of the hierarchy, those concerning the psyche. They propose a society where the needs found on the bottom rungs are already fully realized. But do we live in such a society? One where the base material conditions of wellness are met? Philosopher Slavoj Žižek put this problem to Jordan Peterson in their 2019 debate in Toronto. We'll summarize it in the following video.
Therapists always bracket out the economic dimension of our lives. This is what I like to call the therapeutical epoche. Therapy is built on the liberal concept of the individual, pure competitor without any rigged playing field. Right. What if you are suffering because of capitalism? What if the source of your depression is wage slavery itself? What if it stems from burnout, hustle culture, capitalist temporality, the grind, or just trying to pay your fucking bills? Oh, and on top of wage labor, now you're also supposed to do all this self-care labor? Fuck off. Therapists act as though their patients live in an economic void, that they have no economic facticity. It's like how on sitcoms, characters never seem to struggle financially, and if they do, the problem is resolved by the end of the episode. Right. Exactly. So my biggest problem with therapy is the economic problem. Right. I'm a card-carrying Marxist here. Yeah. What about one's structural economic facticity? This is the question Žižek posed to Jordan Peterson in their debate.
Why do you put so much access to this? We have to begin with a personal change. First set your house in order, then. But I have an extremely common sense, naive question here. But what if in trying to set your house in order, you discover that your house is in disorder precisely because the way the society is messed up, which doesn't mean, okay, let's forget about my house. I hope we agree to say to somebody in North Korea, set your house in order, no?
Are we really going to tell North Koreans that the way to fix their lives is by taking more personal responsibility? What a fucking joke. No, they are suffering because of their authoritarian symbolic order. What if the order itself is oppressive? Just as Americans and most people are suffering due to wage labor, due to their economic circumstances, and can we agree that we need both? More personal responsibility, more social restructuration? Sure. However, I don't need to readjust my subjective relationship towards wage labor. No, I need wage labor itself to change or die. If all therapy is to make us better suited to be wage slaves, then therapy is the new opium of the people. Exactly. It's no coincidence that people talk about therapy as if it were religion.
Today's task, therefore, is to explore the bottom two rungs of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, physiological and safety, and determine whether society is reliably meeting them. Part 3 will take on the top 3 rungs, conclusions and paths forward. So, material conditions. What are they? Material conditions aren't just roads, electric grids, internet, land, trees, rivers, and factories. They encompass the totality of the organization of society, the relations between people, which enable the production of things and civil society. Everything from food, widgets, families, schools, community, churches, institutions, culture, art, politics, and law. So let's break down the needs one by one as listed in Maslow's hierarchy of needs and see where we land. So first we have air under physiological needs. So while air quality has increased remarkably in Europe and North America, outdoor air pollution has increased globally and remains the second greatest killer behind cardiovascular disease. Increased intensity of forest fires from global warming, plus auto and industrial pollution are the main drivers. It also causes cancer, cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, which is asthma. Rates of infection go up. Prenatal exposure also causes a variety of defects, cognitive and neurobehavioral problems. Water. Every year, 3,575,000 people die from water-related diseases, mostly children. Global freshwater demand will outstrip the supply by 40% by 2030. A lot of this is taken up by golf courses, lawns, agricultural subsidies, and desert cities like Las Vegas. North Africa and the Middle East will be hit the worst. US is not far behind, but places like Canada and Russia are some of the safest in the world in terms of this problem. Food. Despite immense global wealth and productivity, over 1.5 billion remain food insecure, and global malnutrition rates are well below targets. 85% of Americans are malnourished. They tend to be well fed, but they're lacking nutrients. Shelter is next. Over 1 billion people today live in slums or shantytowns. U.S. homelessness rates have been climbing nationally by about 6% every year since 2017 and accelerating during COVID. We also are in the midst of a global housing crisis, especially in the rich Western countries, as building lags far behind demand. Rental pricing is also rising relative to income. So Kingston, for example, is one of the more expensive places to live. As you can see here, I have it highlighted with the average rent costing $1,300 and a rent-to-income ratio of 23%, which is much higher than average outside of Toronto and Vancouver. Sleep is next. In the Netherlands, for example, 43% of teens reported insufficient sleep, and 27% reported a sleep disorder. Americans get an average of 6.8 hours sleep, which is well under the 8 recommended. Sleep deprivation lowers testosterone, immunity, and attractiveness, and increases cortisol. It's linked to obesity, high blood pressure, stroke, diabetes, impaired memory, alertness, and concentration. Next, we have urination and excretion, which is much more important than you might think. So 48% of the world's population does not have access to adequate sewage treatment. Many countries dispose of sewage via basic soakways, and more than 80% of the world's wastewater is released into the environment without being treated first. Clothing. Now, today, even the poorest are clothed, which is good, but fast fashion has created a garbage crisis. The US alone throws away 11 million tons of textile waste per year, and the industry contributes up to 10% of global carbon emissions. Next, we have reproduction. So global male fertility is at record lows as sperm counts have halved. Global fertility has collapsed from an average of 5 births per woman in 1950 to 2.3 births per woman in 2021. The population replacement rate is 2.1 births, and capitalism requires constant growth, so this presents a major economic problem for wealthier countries that fall under this threshold. Historically, contraception has helped lower birth rates where they were too high, but now, because of the capitalist economy, we're facing the opposite problem, where we're actually going to need to up the rates. So why aren't people having kids? Well, I think the next section is going to explain that. Moving on up one tier of the pyramid, up to safety needs, we'll start with personal security. So crime is actually down globally, but trending back up since the pandemic. Natural disasters are increasing in frequency and severity with global warming as well. About 43% of billion-dollar natural disaster events have occurred in the last decade alone. Global unrest is rising as protests have reached their highest level in several decades. Something I forgot to put in a slide here was bigotry and prejudice, which still plays a big role around the world. Racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., religious oppression. These can really determine the quality of life you're going to live in certain parts of the world. Employment is a big one. We'll watch a video first.
Let me tell you something. We're talking about jobs, but the quality of those jobs with poultry workers in the richest country in the world, the United States. Dolores, one woman we work with there, told us that she and her co-workers have to wear diapers to work because they are not allowed toilet breaks. This is in the richest country in the world. So don't tell me about low levels of unemployment. You are counting the wrong things. You're not counting dignity of people. You're counting exploited people.
So on the bottom left, we have a graph depicting global unemployment rates, which rose drastically since the pandemic, as you can see there, highest in decades. But as the lady mentioned earlier, the quality of work is also a very important factor as well. If we look a little bit closer, the places where jobs are being created are generally precarious. Part-time, shift work, piecework, independent contracting, no benefits, vacation, no pay leave, no job security, or union support. Today, this accounts for 20% of jobs in Canada and fully a third of jobs in Ontario. Next up is our section on health, and I thought we would use Gabor Mate's new book, The Myth of Normal, to explore how material conditions of capitalist society affect health. From the book, chronic illness, mental to physical, is to a large extent a function or feature of the way things are and not a glitch, a consequence of how we live, not a mysterious aberration. He explains that in biology, a culture refers to a biomechanical broth made to facilitate microbial development. When things go wrong, if the culture is contaminated or a bad mix, they call this a toxic culture, in the same sense that the way society is organized sets the parameters of cultural development and the individuals within it. The book cites work on poverty by Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn at the University of Montreal. Dr. Blackburn states, quote, "So much of what makes people either well or not is not coming from within themselves. It's coming from their circumstances." She discovered that telomeres, which are chromosome sheaths that prevent fraying at the end of chromosomes, they bear the mark of traumas from poverty, racism, war, etc. Studies show that telomere length can accurately predict stress, disease, and longevity. You can figure out when you're going to die, roughly, by the state of your frayed telomeres. Quoting her, "Socioeconomic conditions are visible within ourselves. Circumstances themselves can shape how genes adjust to the environment." Another study from McGill University looked at pregnancy and Ice Storm 98, which found that the more objective stress that a pregnant woman had to live through, things like darkness, cold, isolation, home damage, the more their kids' physiology was marked by that of adversity, even near puberty. We found that objective stress explained how kids varied from one another in a whole host of things: language, obesity, insulin secretion, their immune system, and even IQ was affected. We also saw increased asthma, as well as increased inflammatory genes and immune genes that are connected with autoimmunity. So pregnancy aside, the stress of poverty has been shown to lower IQ. IQ is also a strong predictor of income. Studies show that poverty impairs decision-making, attention, self-control, and cognitive function. So just the act of being born in a poor family necessarily limits the potential for you to rise out of that poverty, just from the cognitive effects alone. Studies also show a high correlation between autoimmune disease and perfectionism, hyper-responsibility and people pleasers, anger suppression, compulsion and self-sacrificing for others, and excessive concern about social acceptability. Anybody know people like that? It's pretty common. These are all dysfunctional coping mechanisms for stress, and they all happen to be symptoms of, you guessed it, toxic positivity, which we talked about last time. Moving on to economic needs. We'll start with poverty, watching this video of me from a video I made back in 2018.
The first plot hole in this children's story is the claim that there's been a reduction in global poverty.
200 years ago, 90% of the world's population subsisted in extreme poverty. Today, fewer than 10% of people do.
You want to make the case that the world is more prosperous and less poor than ever before, and you point to data showing the number of people living on the extreme poverty line, as defined by the World Bank today at $1.90 a day, is down from 2 billion in 1990 to 700 million in 2015. The world is becoming middle class, you say. But surely you know, I know you know, because you're a very clever, well-qualified guy, that there are numerous studies and a number of scholars who dispute that poverty measure as arbitrary, as inaccurate, that in reality, to quote from a recent academic paper by an anthropologist at the LSE, quote, around 4 billion people remain in poverty today, around 2 billion remain hungry, more than ever before in history.
That completely irrelevant to which way the numbers have gone. Of course, the definition of extreme poverty is going to be arbitrary. If you make it higher, then more people will be in poverty. If you make it lower, fewer people.
Exactly.
But no matter what cutoff you set, the direction is downward.
That's not true. That's
yes,
not,
it is.
If you look at the work done by Jason Hickel at the LSE, if you take a poverty line of $5, 1 billion people have been added to the number of people on that poverty measure since 1981. The trend shows the exact opposite when you move it to $5 a day. For example, Professor Lant Pritchett, Harvard colleague of yours, a development economist who studies this stuff, says the poverty line shouldn't be $1.90, it should be $12, $15 a day. And when you make that simple statistical change, the entire picture of poverty changes, and the arguments in your book basically fall apart.
According to Peter Edwards of Newcastle University, if people are to achieve a normal life expectancy, they need double the current IPL, or a minimum of $2.50 per day. But if this higher standard would be adopted, it would seriously make the World Bank look bad. If we were to use it, then the poverty headcount rises above 3.1 billion, almost triple what the World Bank claims. It also shows that poverty is getting worse, not better, with nearly 353 million more people impoverished today than in 1981. With China taken out of this equation totally, the number shoots up from 353 million to 852 million.
Alternatively, Pinker and others like to point to increased access to cheap consumer goods as proof of poverty reduction.
The image we have of poor people as starving and living in squalor really is not accurate. Many of them have things. What they lack is the richness of spirit.
The poor used to be called the have-nots. In 2011, more than 95% of American households under the poverty line had electricity, running water, flushing toilets, a refrigerator, a stove, and color TV.
When you think of poverty, you picture this. But what if I told you it really looks like this? A new report showing poor families in the United States are not what they used to be. Now, many poor families have homes with cable TVs, cell phones, computers, you name it, much, much more. 99% of them have a refrigerator. 81% have a microwave. 78% have air conditioning. 63% have cable TV. 54% have cell phones. 48% have a coffee maker. Very interesting.
But the falling price of necessities is a red herring.
Consumption is increasing, yes, but that's not what's at stake here. What's at stake is whether or not consumption is increasing enough to raise people out of poverty.
The poorer half of the population are as poor today as they were in the past, with barely 5% of total wealth in 2010, just as in 1910.
That's gonna be a big yikes for me, dog. Alright, so if we can all agree $1.90 a day is insufficient, what's a better measure of poverty? According to the New Economics Foundation, if we want to make a meaningful dent in infant mortality, around $8 a day is what's needed. Using this standard, some 5.1 billion humans would count as impoverished as of 2014. That's 80% of the world's population, and it's only gotten worse since then. Lant Pritchett and Charles Kenny of the Center for Global Development have argued that since the global poverty line is based on purchasing power in the US, then naturally it should be linked to the US poverty line, so around $15 a day. That standard would rocket global poverty stats well up into the 90s in percentage points. But even if we leave all these relative and absolute numbers aside,
what matters is the extent of global poverty vis-a-vis our capacity to end it. Only 5% of new income from global growth goes to the poorest 60% of humanity, people living on less than $7.40 a day.
You see this graph here? This is a measure of global poverty in relation to our capacity to end it.
In 1990, it would have cost 10.5% of world GDP to lift everyone above the poverty line. In 2013, it would have cost only 3.3%. Our capacity to end poverty has improved by a factor of 3.18. Meanwhile, the poverty rate has improved by only a factor of 1.23. This means that the moral egregiousness of poverty is 2.58 times worse than it was in 1990. Morally, we have regressed as a civilization.
Poverty is getting exponentially cheaper to solve by the minute, yet we've made virtually no progress in the past half century. I wonder what could be getting in the way.
So 2 takeaways from this video. Poverty bad for wellness, and capitalist society has not meaningfully been able to raise most of the global population out of these conditions. All right, moving on to wealth inequality. So for those who claim that everyone is getting richer everywhere, well, here is how global wealth distribution has changed from 1980 to 2016. As you can see, virtually all of it went to the top 0.1%. It's probably more like 0.00 or 0.0001%. As of 2021, the bottom 55% own 1% of global wealth, and the top 1% own 45% of global wealth. Next up is another short video outlining some of the effects of wealth inequality on human wellness.
You also mentioned inequality, which is a big discussion point right now in the world today. The World Bank, the IMF, the World Economic Forum, even all of these august institutions are saying inequality is a problem, it hurts growth. You have books like The Spirit Level linking rising income inequality to higher rates of homicide, imprisonment, infant mortality, mental illness. And yet you say in the book, economic inequality is not in itself a dimension of human well-being.
That's right.
A large 2017 study that questioned almost 42,000 people across 27 countries found that the larger the inequality in a society, the more the privileged group supports the hierarchy. People in this group will also be more willing to use violence in order to keep their position. Great. So the richer you are in relation to everyone else, the more you become a sadistic psychopath. More recently, the social psychologist Dr. Keltner demonstrated that the wealthier people are, the more difficult it is for them to uphold basic norms of decency and reciprocity. Trust is tightly correlated to economic inequality. In a massive 2018 meta-analysis of the literature, authors found that 16 of the 26 studies found a significant positive relationship between income inequality and risk of depression.
When I feel depressed, like loads of people, I say I feel down, right? And as I was learning about the causes of depression and anxiety for my book Lost Connections, I started to realize I don't think that's a metaphor. There's this amazing professor at Stanford called Robert Sapolsky, who in his early 20s went to live with a troop of baboons in Kenya. And it was his job to figure out when are baboons most stressed out. So his job was to hit them with little tranquilizer darts and then take a blood test and measure something called cortisol, which is a hormone that baboons and us release when we're stressed. And baboons live in this hierarchy, so the females don't, interestingly, but the men live in a very strict hierarchy. So if there's 30 men, number 1 noses above number 2, number 2 noses above number 3, number 12 noses above number 13, and that really determines a lot. It determines who you get to have sex with, it determines what you get to eat, it determines whether you get to sit in the shade or you're pushed out into the heat. You know, it's a really, really significant where you are in the hierarchy. And what Professor Sapolsky found is baboons are most stressed in 2 situations. One is when their status is insecure. So if you're the top guy and someone's circling, which comes for you, you will be massively stressed. And the other situation is when you feel you're at the bottom of a hierarchy. You've been kind of humiliated. And what Professor Sapolsky found, which I think is really noticed and then it was later developed by other scientists, is when you feel you've been pushed to the bottom, what you do is you show something called a submission gesture. So baboons will raise, I say you, I assume no baboons are watching this, maybe they are. A baboon will put its body down physically, it will put its head down, it will put its bottom in the air, and it will cover its head. So it clearly seems to be communicating, just leave me alone, you've beaten me, okay, you've beaten me. And what lots of scientists have subsequently developed, people like Professor Paul Gilbert in Britain and Professor Kate Pickett and Professor Richard Wilkinson, also in Britain, have really developed is this idea that actually what human depression is in part, not entirely, but in part, is a form of a submission gesture. It's a way of saying, I can't cope with this anymore, right? Particularly people who feel they've been pushed to the bottom of hierarchies, or who feel, remember the other stressful situations when you feel your status is insecure. It's a way of just going, okay, I retreat, I don't want this fight anymore. You've beaten me. It's a kind of very strong evolutionary impulse where you feel you're under attack to just submit in the hope that the stress and anxiety will then go away, that the sources of the stress and anxiety will then go away. And one thing that's so important, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson really developed this, is they've shown, so as inequality grows, depression and anxiety grow. They've shown this is a very robust effect, right? This helps us to explain it. If you live in Norway, your status is relatively secure, right? No one's that high, no one's that low. Movement between where you are is not so extreme. If you live in the United States, especially today, which is we're now at the greatest levels of inequality since the 1920s, there's a few people at the very top, there's a kind of precarious middle, and there's a huge and swelling bottom, right? So you can see why in the United States you've got more people who'd be showing a submission gesture, who'd be like, oh Jesus, I've been beaten, than there would be in Norway. This is why inequality is one of the drivers of depression and anxiety, and why dealing with inequality reduces inequality and anxiety. It's one of the things that really shocked me actually, was looking at in the United States, the group with the lowest depression by far is the Amish. So I went and spent time with an Amish community. The Amish live in these homogenous groups which are incredibly equal. The richest Amish is worth as much as the poorest Amish, right? But we can learn from the fact that in these highly equal and homogenous groups, you don't have that extreme status stress. Now, I don't want to go as far as the Amish do, but moving closer to it would be one of the factors that would reduce depression and anxiety.
The World Health Organization released data showing that people in more equal societies are far less likely to experience mental illness. In 1996, the editor of the British Medical Journal hypothesized that the big idea is that what matters in determining mortality and health in society is less the overall wealth of that society, and more how evenly wealth is distributed. The more equally the wealth is distributed, the better the health of that society. Since then, the big idea has been widely tested. More than 200 peer-reviewed studies of the association have been published. Income inequality has been variously associated with lower life expectancy, higher rates of infant and child mortality, shorter height, poor self-reported health, low birth weight, AIDS, depression, mental illness, and obesity. An American study confirmed this theme. They found a significant correlation between the percentage of total household income received by the less well-off 50% in each state and all-cause mortality. In addition, income inequality was also significantly associated with age-specific mortalities and rates of low birth weight, homicide, violent crime, work disability, expenditures on medical care and police protection, smoking, and sedentary activity. Rates of unemployment, imprisonment, recipients of income assistance and food stamps, lack of medical insurance, and educational outcomes were also worse as income inequality increased.
So not only is wealth inequality directly linked to several negative health outcomes, it actually also leads to greater economic instability.
The single biggest impact on growth is the widening gap between the lower middle class and poor households compared to the rest of society. Rising inequality is estimated to have knocked more than 10 percentage points off growth in Mexico and New Zealand over the past 2 decades up to the Great Recession. The paper finds new evidence that the main mechanism through which inequality affects growth is by undermining educational opportunities for children from poor socioeconomic backgrounds, lowering social mobility, and hampering skills development.
This concentration of wealth actually kind of creates a huge amount of distortions and volatility in the economy. So you have real wages staying flat or falling for most of the population. That means that the aggregate demand, the consumer buying demand of people at the bottom and the middle is really not as engaged. And then at the very top, you have this unreal concentration of assets, which leads to sort of some unreal risk-taking, meaning people at the very top, I'm talking about, the top 1% of households, are starting to move and a portion of their wealth into more financially speculative investments, investments that get higher returns than the real economy, which isn't, returning a lot in terms of interest or earnings. So you have this twin dynamic. You have stagnant wages on the bottom, and then you have concentrated wealth at the top, looking more and more, venturing into the sort of speculative arena of the marketplace. And all of that leads to certain volatility, huge volatility. So just take the energy market today, or the last couple of months, or real estate in major urban areas. Those are all local and national and global economies that are being distorted by these great inequities of wealth.
One of the main drivers of wealth inequality has been the decoupling of wages and productivity after the 1973 global economic crisis. In plain English, what this means is that post-World War II, worker wages rose in lockstep alongside profits. Meaning as society got richer, as bosses got richer, real wages rose at the same pace. But in the 1970s, this happy marriage broke apart for political and economic reasons that we'll explore in a minute. What this means is, if wages had have kept pace with productivity, your real wage, adjusted for inflation, would be roughly 4 times greater than it is today. And finally, for wealth inequality, public services and public transportation are also key indicators of wellness. But the post-1970s neoliberal phase of capitalism saw the privatization and slashing of much of the world's public services, greatly reducing the, quote, social wage. The concept being that if society shares access to the commonwealth, a relatively low working wage is no longer really a main source of insecurity. Next up, inflation. It's currently at its highest rate since the early 1980s. Inflation attacks the poor, working class, and small businesses most, but benefits big capital by concentrating wealth as monopolies swallow up smaller, struggling firms, and workers lose bargaining power. Crises and recessions are inherent to capitalism, occurring roughly every 10 years with increasing severity. This includes countries like communist China as well. They actually are facing business cycles and economic slowdowns just like the rest of us. The crisis we are currently entering has been called an unprecedented triple bubble in the property, stock, and bond markets. Now, add inflation to that, and we have a perfect storm. things are not looking good for the next 10, 20 years. The reason capitalist crises get worse over time comes down to the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Every crisis plays an important role in capitalism, sweeping away unprofitable sectors, consolidating capital, and allowing new profitable sectors to emerge from the ashes. But over time, profitability restores, but at lower and lower rates, as automation, systems, and techniques approach the limit of their development. As you can see here, from 1869 to 2009, the world historic rate of profit is on a downward trend towards zero, despite all the recoveries and advancements that have happened. So to summarize, the problem of wellness and our current material conditions, play a short video.
Definitely not trying to minimize the ability of psychiatry and medicine to save people's lives, but the philosophical question here is, can we talk about mental illness in exclusively medical terms? Because doctors in my country have started talking about people with SLS, shit life syndrome. And it's obviously not a medical condition, but people who work crap, precarious jobs, who aren't being paid enough, who can't make rent, who live in filthy, depressing cities, or they get discriminated against, or you live in a country where everything's getting worse all the time and nobody in charge knows what they're doing, and they're all just blinding assholes, or you love someone and they die, or you love someone and they hurt you really bad. Those things can impair your normal function a bit like a disease can. In his book, Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher writes, "It goes without saying that all mental illnesses are neurologically instantiated, but this says nothing about their causation. If it is true, for instance, that depression is constituted by low serotonin levels, what still needs to be explained is why particular individuals have low levels of serotonin. By privatizing these problems, treating them as if they were caused only by chemical imbalances in the individual's neurology and or by their family background, any question of social, systemic causation is ruled out." Mark killed himself in 2017.
So to wrap up, today we assess the material conditions for wellness located on the bottom 2 levels of Maslow's pyramid. Given the evidence, we can safely conclude that society in its totality is not adequately meeting those needs, even in the rich democracies, for the simple reason that wellness is not what they are designed for. They're instead organized primarily around reproducing capitalism. Any improvements in wellness is both accidental and can be reversed at any time. Nothing is guaranteed under this mode of production. Next time, part 3, we'll explore the less material conditions for wellness found on Maslow's hierarchy: social needs of love and belonging, esteem needs, which is strength, competence, mastery, self-confidence, independence, and freedom, intellectual needs, aesthetic needs, and self-actualization. And finally, we will explore the paths forward. Thank you and have a good weekend.